Welcome to Books of Our Time, produced by the Massachusetts School of Law and seen nationwide. Today we shall discuss a book that deals with the false personas that people are often forced to display to the outside world. The book is entitled Covering: The Hidden Assault on Our Civil Rights. The author is Kenji Yoshino, a professor of law at Yale. He is here to discuss his work with me. And I am Lawrence R. Velvel, the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law. Kenji, thank you for coming from New Haven.
Thanks for having me.
Given what happened, I think you got from New Haven to Andover faster than we got from Andover to Brookline. But hey, is it fair to say that the fundamental argument of your book is that except where there are good reasons to the contrary, as for example in the need to obey laws, people's methods of acting should not have to conform to the purported mainstream or the purported majority?
Exactly right, Larry. The book's title is Covering, and what I'm really trying to do with that title is to hammer a new word into the public vocabulary. So covering is a sociologist Irving Goffman's term for how we all downplay disfavored attributes in order to fade into the mainstream. And it's different from passing in the sense that passing is when you mask an identity from all viewers, whereas covering is when you articulate the identity, but you still seek to mute it or tone it down in order to make other people around you more comfortable.
Yeah. And you said at lunch, and I thought it was very interesting, that you wanted to find a word, and covering turned out to be the word, because oftentimes people think in words. They think in categories represented by words. And until we get a word for something, and I think the example used was sexual harassment, until we get a word for something, people have a hard time, as the English say, getting their minds around the idea.
Exactly right. I should give Gloria Steinem credit for that, because she was the person who said that sometimes we need to find a word for a problem before we can even see it, much less solve it.
Yeah.
And sexual harassment was her example.
Yeah.
And similarly, I think that with this word covering, we're going to be able to identify a phenomenon in which we all engage, that is downplaying aspects of ourselves that are disfavored in the mainstream.
Yeah. Every day we do it. I mean, it can be said, can it not, Kenji, that covering amounts to acting in ways that are socially approved, even if that is not our own personality.
Exactly. Again, covering would be a situation in which you had some sense of your authentic self, whether that be a racial self, whether that be self based on gender identity or sexual orientation or religion, and that society would nonetheless force you to downplay or to hide that in the public
Let's give
sphere.
people some examples so that they'll understand exactly what it is you're talking about. A black woman who wears her hair in cornrows and is told by her employer not to wear that kind of a hairstyle, and who then comes in the approved page boy, Caucasian white woman hairstyle. That would be covering, right?
Exactly. And the instance that you're referring to is an actual case that was litigated and in which the African American plaintiff lost.
Yeah.
I'm also thinking about things like Latinos or Latinas who speak Spanish in English-only workplaces, who are fired on that basis and who are also usually denied relief in the courts.
But covering would be to speak only English.
Exactly. So individuals who refuse to cover are policed back into the norm, and to the extent that they say, I shouldn't have to do this because the demand that I assimilate is not legitimate, they tend to lose in the courts.
What are some of the other examples? Because you have so many in the book. Because this brings it home to people on a very concrete level. What are some of the examples that, for example, women in the workplace do to cover?
The dominant one that I can think of, Larry, is that women in the workplace are often asked to conform to the norm of the ideal male worker. And the primary form this takes is for women to actually downplay the fact that they have children or not to have children at all. And so, as many of my students, my law students, are aware, unfortunately, the word mommy track was actually coined in the legal context where a New York Times reporter observed that if you look at the white shoe law firms in Manhattan, it's not that women are now categorically excluded, but that the partnership ranks tend to be made up of men and childless women on the one hand, and then there's a pink-collar ghetto for the women who both want to be lawyers and mothers.
Yeah, I think you say that if things keep going this way, there will come a time when law firms will be comprised, big law firms anyway, will be comprised almost exclusively of men, childless women, and the laboring force, so to speak, will be women with children. And women, you say, don't talk at work about the fact that they have children, lest their interest in work be misperceived?
Exactly, and so that would be a quintessential covering demand that would be leveled at women in the sense of, even if you have children in the workplace and you've made that decision, one of the mantras that I've heard in interview after interview with professional women was that women would say, if I ever have to leave work to take care of my kids, I will never say that that's a reason. So I'll say I'm going to another meeting, I have a doctor's appointment, anything but the fact that I'm the primary child care.
Because that would cause people to think that a woman is not sufficiently committed to work.
Exactly, and that she's seen as an inauthentic worker in a way in which a man would not. So if I say I have to go home to take care of my kids, I get, cred for being a good dad. But a woman is now...
How about black men? Aside from, of course, the one obvious thing is they shouldn't, they can't wear, if they're going to cover, they cannot wear cornrows at work. I have to say, with Richard Hamilton and this fella Haslam from Miami wearing cornrows on television, this may be a thing of the past one of these days pretty soon. And it's not entirely a joke on my part, but because I think a lot of this has to do with what we get used to in one way or another.
I agree.
Yeah, but what are some of the things that, let's say, black lawyers or black businessmen have to do and do in order to cover in the workplace?
Right. Well, there's actually a heartbreaking narrative by Paul Barrett called The Good Black that chronicles...
we discussed that on one of these shows, by the way.
Oh, did you really?
Yeah,
terrific.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, it's a wonderful book, and I really would recommend it. Paul Barrett is a white journalist for the Wall Street Journal. And his roommate happened to be an African-American man. And this chronicles his roommate Larry Mungin's attempts to make it in corporate America and all the covering strategies that he adopted. And a lot of them had to do with grooming, so that he was kind of known as a fop in the workplace because he would dress up in these Armani suits. And so this seems like a very trivial thing, but when Barrett asked him why he did this, Mungin said, well, when I am dressed up in a suit, I get friendly nods from my colleagues and my neighbors in this rich suburb of Virginia. When I'm actually dressed to go work out, then people clutch their purses, don't recognize me, and they back away. And he had grown up in a household where his mother had said, if you want to make it in America, you must not talk street talk. You must dress white. You must not be too militant about your black activism or make other people feel guilty about the fact that you've been subjected to racism. So this family stands for Martin Luther King, not for Malcolm X, et cetera, et cetera. And what's so heartbreaking about the story is that he doesn't actually make partner. And one of the messages of the story is that oftentimes when you suppress your cultural affinities, that you are actually disabled as well as enabled. So you're enabled in some ways, like that you're more palatable to the white mainstream, but you cut yourself off, for example, from black communities of support, you cut yourself off from your cultural heritage, you had a more strained relationship with this family of origin because of this. So it exacts immense costs. And this really is not a thing of the past, and that this book just came out a few years ago, but it's also not just an idiosyncratic story about one person. Recently, in 2003, there was a lawsuit about John T. Malloy's perennially popular Dress for Success book. And he's a chapter on how minorities should dress. And the dominant message, which he'll say in words of one syllable, is that minorities should always dress white. And that he said, African Americans should not wear afros or any other hairstyle associated with African American identity. And this is my favorite, Larry. He says, Latinos or Hispanics should not wear any grease in their hair, pencil-lined mustaches, or any clothing which looks sharp or precise, which to my mind is not a very sharp or precise piece of advice, because what is sharp or precise clothing? But we're living in an environment where the way in which Americans discriminate has shifted. So in the first generation, it was very explicit. It was no racial minorities, no women, no gays, no religionists, no people with disabilities allowed. And the triumph of modern civil rights has been that many of these forms of categorical discrimination have been retired. But human cussedness
Yeah.
being what it is, we
Yeah.
shouldn't expect that legislation itself is going to extirpate
Yeah.
that animus
Yeah.
from our souls.
Yeah.
And the way in which the second form of discrimination, this new wave of discrimination is taking place, is that it targets the subset of the original group that refuses to assimilate to mainstream norms. The African American who refuses
Yeah.
to act white, the woman who refuses to play
Yeah.
like a man, the gay
Yeah.
person who is
Yeah.
not straight acting,
Yeah.
basically everyone who refuses to cover.
Well, we'll get to that. I want to say that I understand the language point very well, because growing up on the streets of Chicago, as I did, although whether I've ever grown up is subject to question in a lot of people's minds, I was a past master at street talk and still am. And one finds in the professional world, and I have to restrain myself, and I don't always, one finds in the professional world that this does not, to use a street term, go down.
Right.
People do not like this. And one of the great things about professional school is that it teaches you a language that you did not, may not have known before, in the case of many of us that we did not know before. FDR covered. This is a staggering fact when you think about it. But a man who is regarded almost universally as either the greatest or the second greatest, some people would rank him third, never any worse than third, president in American history, he covered. Explain how he covered.
Yes, this is actually one of Irving Goffman's great examples in which he tries to distinguish between passing and covering. So what FDR used to do is he used to always make sure that he was behind a table, at least sort of taller than this one, before his cabinet entered. And he wasn't passing, right, because at least his cabinet knew that he was disabled and in a wheelchair. But he was covering, trying to make sure that his more conventionally presidential qualities were at the forefront of the interaction, and his less conventionally presidential quality, namely the fact that he was disabled, was in the background. So even though he wasn't ashamed of being disabled and is known by many as a president who was disabled, he nonetheless strove to keep it in the background. Another example that I think is really staggering is perhaps the most famous person with a disability in world history, Helen Keller, also covered because she had a protruding eye. So even though she was a spokesperson for individuals who are blind and deaf, she used to always make sure that she was photographed from angles that hid her protruding eye, and then later on had her natural eyes replaced with beautiful blue glass ones, so that unsuspecting journalists would always comment on the beauty of her eyes and the irony that these beautiful eyes were blind.
To go back to FDR, I remember from the book, the Helen Keller thing, which was mind-blowing, really. To go back to the FDR thing, the public at large did not know that FDR was terribly crippled. And by covering this way, by having pictures of him, or by getting behind the desk to begin with, or by having pictures of him standing up there with the cigarette and the wave, and you never saw the struggle. If you ever read about what a struggle it was to walk the 10 steps, clutching his son's arm off, with like a vice-like grip, the 10 steps to get there. This took an awful lot physically out of FDR.
Absolutely, and I think that this is one of the most poignant instances of covering, because I think that when you think about covering in the disability context, because a lot of times people say, well, what's the big deal? Like, we have the melting pot ideal in America. We all have to conform in some ways, as you said. You have to actually, cabin your street talk when you're in a professional environment as a dean of a major law school.
Here.
Not here, but in your professional life you do. And so what's the big deal? And I think that one of the ways of bringing home the harm here is to say, well, first of all, the first point that you made is that sometimes the same activity can be covering to some audiences and passing to others, depending on the literacy of the audience, right? What FDR was doing vis-a-vis his cabinet was covering because they knew he was in a wheelchair.
And the reporters.
Right, but the more broader American public, he was often passing. So similarly, if a man who's gay, walks down the street holding hands with his boyfriend, like to people who know he's already gay, he's just refusing to cover. But to other people, they may be apprised for the first time he's gay by the fact that he's engaging this quote-unquote flaunting behavior. But I think to go to the more deep point that you were raising, I think that the disability context is a wonderful context to raise when people start talking about how covering is trivial. Because if you talk to disabled people, they all engaged in strategies that require them to suffer a huge amount of physical pain. So individuals from the disabled community talk about foregoing canes or wheelchairs or the very paraphernalia that permit them to function in order to make other people around them comfortable. So they endure acute pain in order to assure the comfort of able-bodied people like you or I. And I think that it's very, very troubling to think that we are in a society that says, on the one hand, individuals with disabilities should be treated equally to people who are able-bodied, but on the other hand, exacts through some set of social norms this idea of we're not comfortable with you walking around with a cane, and we would much rather that you suffer pain than I be made uncomfortable.
You know, one of the areas in which I think people suffer enormous psychological pain by attempts to cover is something that we have covered, if I may say so, on this show, in a book called Limbo. It's a wonderful book written by Alfred, oh gosh, the name's escaping me at the moment. He's a reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer. And what it's all about is what happens to a person from the working class who joins the professional class and who finds that his very ways of thinking, his or her, it's hers too, very modes of speech have to be changed, and that they don't really fit in the professional world, although they are, quote, covering so that they do, but they also don't fit in back at home anymore. This is psychologically extraordinarily painful, even debilitating, perhaps.
I couldn't agree more, and this is actually one of the major themes of the book, is that one of the things that we need to do with this generation of civil rights is, even more than before, take the project of civil rights outside of the law. So, as you know, as a law professor, one of the major gaps in our anti-discrimination law has to do with class, right? So this country has just not dealt with class as an anti-discrimination category in any robust way. So either we have to get class included among, the constitutional and the statutory protections we have against state and employer-based discrimination. Don't hold your breath, right? Or we have to understand that many of the problems that we're dealing with are not going to be redressable through law. So whenever I give this talk, I've come to expect this kind of question, which I think of as like the straight white guy question, where somebody raises their hand and says, I understand why you should be protected for things you can't help, like your skin color, your chromosomes, or your sexual orientation, if that's innate. But why shouldn't you have to cover? Because I have to cover all the time. I have to cover my depression, or I have to cover the fact that I was a survivor of abuse, or I have to cover my illiteracy, or even a positive attribute like the fact that I'm an artist. One thing that comes up again and again, Larry, is that I have to cover the fact that I'm working class. And because this person continues, I don't fall into the canon of protected classifications, I'm simply viewed as like an impediment to the civil rights of other people rather than somebody who might have a civil rights claim of my own. And I absolutely agree with them. I think I surprise them when I agree that these other identities are just as worthy of our solicitude in the cultural realm. And I'm not saying, to be clear, that discrimination against poets is the same as discrimination against African Americans, but I am saying that the project of civil rights for me has always been the project of allowing ourselves to pursue our human flourishing as human beings without limitations based on bias or witless conformity. And when we deal with the class issue, this phenomenon has been very well documented, which is that individuals rise from the working class into the middle class, and they're kind of caught in a limbo, which is, I guess, the title of this book.
His name was Lubrano, Alfred Lubrano wrote this book.
And it's a really poignant experience because it either requires you, which many people do, to engage in the kind of code switching, right, where you are one person in one context and immediately toggle back to being something else in another context. Or it requires you to be one kind of person who doesn't fit quite neatly into either context. And I think that's a limbo that you're describing.
Oh, absolutely. It's terrible. There are some other things, and then we'll get, in a second segment of the show, I want to get to the question of gayness and the particular illuminating the general. But there are physical things that women do. Nose jobs, eyelid jobs. Explain an eyelid job. That just blew my mind, so to speak. I'd never heard of that.
Right. Well, there's actually surgery that it's mostly women who engage in it, but I don't actually view that as gender-based covering so much as ethnicity-based covering, right? Asian American women, or Asian women generally, actually, I used to have fights with a friend of mine who was an Asian American woman, have these eye jobs done so that their eyes look more Caucasian in nature. And if you actually just go on the website, I think they're called blepharoplasties or something. If you go on the website and just type in eyelid surgery, you'll come up with many sites and surgeons who are offering the service.
Can I interject this? It seems to me, now I can understand that if a Jewish woman has a nose job, you can't necessarily tell. Sometimes people have particularly Jewish-looking features, so perhaps the woman will continue to look Jewish. But you can't necessarily tell. Sometimes she will not. But an Asian woman, you can change her eyelids. I mean, isn't one still going to know that somebody is of Asian descent, Chinese or Korean or Vietnamese, who, in my biased way, I think are the most beautiful women in the world. If you've ever seen them in Vietnam, they're just phenomenally beautiful people. And it speaks to the extent to which a white standard of beauty, which is by way of saying a white standard of acting, has become all dominant, hardly begins to describe it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, when I referred to this fight that I used to have with an Asian American friend of mine, she used to criticize a mutual friend of ours for having had this eyelid surgery. And I said to her, well, it's not only Asian Americans who are having it. You know, I spent some time growing up in Japan, and Japanese women also have this. And so you can't just say that this is white supremacy in America. And her response was, that just makes it worse, because that means that white standards of beauty have colonized the world rather than simply one country. So I think that is a really interesting
You know, not to put too fine a point on it, because we've got to go to break, but all of a sudden you can see how all of this relates in some way to the fury against the export of American culture into the Middle East and into the Far East, when our standards are being applied by people elsewhere who have 2,000 years of different standards which could be used. We will come back in just a minute, and I want to talk about the particular illuminating the universal and why you wrote your book in the particular way that you did. Stay with us. We'll be right back with Kenji Yoshino. Welcome back. Kenji, before we go to the way you wrote the book and gayness and the particular illuminating the universal, sometimes people cover, as you mentioned to me, sometimes people cover very desirable attributes. Not that any of these others have been undesirable, but some are affirmatively looked at as desirable attributes by society, and yet people seem to feel the need to downplay them by covering, not letting people explain what you mean. For example, in the African American scholastic context, explain what you mean by that.
Right. So this is actually a phenomenon that I would call reverse covering, right? Where people are forced back to behave in ways that conform to stereotypes about their group. So one of the really troubling things that we've seen in recent years is that African American students who excel academically and who are fading into the white mainstream get policed back out of that culture by other African Americans, or perhaps even by some whites, who accuse them of trying to act white. And this is known as oppositional culture. So one of the really troubling things about this is that these pressures for assimilation move in both directions, right? So, you know, Asian American who is accused of acting too white is called the banana, a white person inside a yellow skin. You know, African American is called an Oreo, you know, a Latino is called a coconut, right? And these epithets generally come from the minority group in an attempt to police the minority into solidarity with the minority group. And you can understand why this defensive separatism would take place, but it's still putting people in a box. And I think that I'm often accused of trying to have it both ways, because I'm both against covering demands and against reverse covering demands. But I think that we can be fully, I think that's fully consistent in the way that what I'm really trying to allow people to do.
Why would anybody say that you're being inconsistent? I don't follow that, because all you're basically saying, you know, quote, all you're basically saying is people should be free to be what they really are.
Exactly, and so that's the way I would resolve the inconsistency. But I think that some people hear, well, you're against covering, so you're saying covering is bad, and then you're also saying the reverse of covering, reverse covering, is also bad. So how can something and its opposite both be bad?
Well, you know what Demers say, foolish consistency is the hobgoblin.
You know,
I see that in my faculty a lot, because we have a lot of people who come from Irish American backgrounds, And one thing that was always moved them when they were children is don't get above yourself. And I read that in books about the Irish-American experience. In fact, one of the first books we ever did here by a reporter from the Globe called Maureen Dizelle discussed the Irish-American experience. They believe that was a part of it. And that's kind of like forcing reverse covering. Don't get above yourself. Don't think you're too good. Who do you think you are anyway? You're no better than the rest of us. And they were beating people down with that.
Exactly. And oftentimes the most stringent forms of assimilation are exacted by people of minority groups upon group members, right?
Yeah.
So if you want to look for
Yeah.
real orthodoxy, here's a segue into the gay discussion. Don't look at what strays do to gays. Look at what gays do to gays, right? So go to Fire Island, where everyone has to wake up at the same time and listen to the same music and have the same body, and they don't call them gay clones for nothing, right? So, and this is totally sociologically intelligible in that what these minority groups are doing is engaging in a form of defensive separatism where they're fighting to replicate their own culture, right? Orthodox Judaism would be another example of this.
Sure.
But from the perspective of somebody who values individual autonomy and a kind of authenticity that is individualized, as I do, both the covering and the reverse covering demands are equally problematic.
Yeah. Explain why. I mean, the first half of your book is about the psychological torture you underwent because you were gay, what happened to you because of it, how you ultimately came out of the closet, and also you mentioned the fact that you seem in your own mind unable to get over, if I may put it, to avoid talking about it. You have a compulsion to talk about it with people. Why don't you explain all that and why you wrote the book the way you did, including, of course, your idea that what happens to you personally, the particular, illuminates the universal. It sometimes used to be called the politics is personal. That's not so different.
Exactly. No, I think that's exactly right. Well, what was really interesting, Larry, is that when I originally wrote this argument, I really wrote it as a law review article, and there was no personal dimension to it at all. And so when I was going to turn it into a book, I was half tempted just to slap, 2 covers on the law review article, which was quite lengthy, and just send it to a university press.
Yeah.
But something in me balked, in the way that you describe it, doing that. And I realized that the resistance in me came from the fact that I knew that if I really wanted to prosecute the argument for the importance of authenticity, I had to risk some authenticity of my own, and that if I were really to be honest about where the roots of this argument lay, it wasn't in some highfalutin theoretical idea. It was really coming from my own lived experience as a gay man.
Yeah.
And Nietzsche once said that all philosophy is involuntary and unconscious autobiography.
Yeah.
And I don't know if this is true of all scholarship, but it's certainly true of my own.
But let me interject that, if I may. And I know that this happened to you too at one point. It used to be in the 70s, maybe even into the 80s, when the powers that be in the legal academic world would tell women, write about serious stuff like torts and contracts. Don't write about women's rights and family matters. And they would tell African American guys, don't write about civil rights. Write about serious stuff like torts and contracts. That's exactly the same thing you're talking about. It's ridiculous, but that's the way it was.
Exactly, and it's actually not just something that is part of a bygone era. When I started teaching at Yale Law School in 1998, a very well-meaning colleague took me aside and said, Kenji, I love this quote, he said, Kenji, you'll do a lot better at this law school if you are a homosexual professional than if you're a professional homosexual.
Yeah, right.
And I knew exactly what he meant. He meant I do much better as a constitutional law professor who wrote on mainstream subjects like separation of powers, who just kind of happened to be gay, than I would be as the academic I've now become, who's someone who works in civil rights, who writes on gay subjects, and who works on gay rights cases.
It was excruciatingly painful for you, and I took it that what you meant was you were using yourself as being symptomatic of gay people generally. It was excruciatingly painful for you first to discover and admit to yourself what you really were, and then to admit it to the rest of the world, because our society, I mean, frankly speaking, you think that and I'm not denying it, but my point here is that you believe we have a white Anglo-Saxon, heterosexual, I can't talk, I guess, heterosexual culture. And
a movement through 3 different demands for assimilation that grew increasingly weak over time. So these are conversion, passing, and covering. So in the first phase, through my young adulthood, all I wanted to do was to convert to being straight. And I can remember, going to the college chapel at Oxford and praying to become straight. And it's very painful for me to remember that younger self knelt in prayer because that younger self so ardently willed the annihilation of the man that I've now become.
Women, of course, couldn't convert. African Americans, by and large, well, they can't convert. Some could pass if they were white enough. The only people and gays couldn't convert. The only people I ever heard of who could convert were the Jews in Spain, the Marranos. And, you either converted or they burned you.
Right. Yeah, I actually, just to kind of finish the arc of the narrative, I felt like individually I moved from conversion and I overcame conversion and accepted the fact that I was gay, but still passed to other people. And then it was only when I started teaching at the law school that I overcame the passing demand and started to fight the covering demand. It's only when I wrote this book that I feel like I've, to some degree, made some inroads into the covering demand. But to tie it back to your point, I realized that this was just not my own narrative, but also a narrative of gay rights as a whole.
Right.
Because through the middle decades of the 20th century, gays as a group were driven into conversion therapy, whether through electroshock therapy or psychoanalysis or even lobotomies or castration.
It's awful.
It's shocking.
Psychiatry was as complicit in this society as in Russia, where if you didn't conform politically, they called you a nut and they sent you off to a sanitarium.
Absolutely. Until 1973, when homosexuality was taken out of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual as a mental illness. It was open season on gay men and women by the psychiatric profession, exactly. But then, it was only with the rise of the gay rights movement that we flip in emphasis from the conversion demand to the passing demand. That's the military's don't ask, don't tell policy of we won't witch hunt you out of your closet so long as you live your entire life there. And it's only at the turn of the millennium that we're finally moving into you can be gay and say that you're gay so long as you don't flaunt, so long as you don't shove it into our faces.
Do you think the military's don't ask, don't tell policy has been either wise or successful?
Well, I don't have strong opinions about this at all. I think it's been an utter and complete disaster.
Geez, I'd hate to see a strong opinion. They say that to me all the time. So, it's the pot calling the kettle black. But go ahead.
Right. Well, just to give a little bit of background, the military policy that preceded Don't Ask, Don't Tell was a 1981 regulation that said homosexuality is incompatible with military service, so that if you were gay, you were out. The Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy was framed as a kind of compromise between Bill Clinton, who said that he wanted to lift the ban on gays entirely, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Congress, who wanted to keep the ban in place. So ostensibly, it was a movement away from a conversion regime to a passing regime that said, we will actually allow you to serve in the military, so this is an improvement. It's more benign than the policy we had before. So you're getting half.
Pass yourself off as a heterosexual. Nobody's going to ask, and you don't tell. And you're passing.
Exactly, and so you get the half loaf, according to the policy. However, as you know, Larry, in the years immediately following Don't Ask, Don't Tell, separations of gay service members skyrocketed. So they actually went up after this more benign, inclusive policy was put into place. I think there are a number of reasons for that. I think one thing was the huge irony that Don't Ask, Don't Tell, a policy about gay silence, spawned more speech and public debate about homosexuality in this country than anything that had preceded it. And so suddenly people became much more aware that Joe, who they just thought was not the marrying kind, was actually a gay person in the shower with them. That's one thing. Another thing is that when you start having policies like Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which is actually the first time, to my knowledge, that the word homosexuality was enacted into the United States Code as a word, you have this kind of don't think about pink elephants, right? So like when someone says to you, don't think about pink elephants, like how can you not think about pink elephants? So if someone is saying to you every day, don't think about the gays in our midst, suddenly you're like, well, all I can think about are the gays in my midst.
Tell the story about Eisenhower and Johnny Phelps. I think that's a priceless story.
Yeah, well, this is actually a useful story, I think, because it goes back to the idea of how when people actually stand their ground and don't cover, they can often not just persuade other people, but actually advance their own, career or human flourishing. So I think the conventional wisdom in this country is that if you want to get ahead, you have to assimilate so that the straight acting gay person or the non-flaunting gay person will get ahead more, the passing homosexual will get ahead further. But that doesn't take into account, first of all, the kind of isolation and self-estrangement that the closet can exact, but it also doesn't take into account how sometimes coming out can be a transformative move. So Eisenhower directed one of his favorite staff members, Johnny Phelps, a woman, to root out all of the lesbians, from his staff.
By the way, why did he do that?
I don't know. I was actually puzzled about that. So I don't have a clear answer for what was driving him at that particular moment. But her response to him was, I will do whatever you order me to do, and I will give you a list of all of the people who are either openly lesbian or suspected of being lesbian tomorrow, but you have to know that my name is going to head the list and that you are going to lose a lot of your most important staff members. And he immediately kind of rescinded the order. And I think that coming out has transformative potential because it shows that an individual who you like and respect is also gay. But it also shows that even if you disapprove of the identity, many people respect the courage that it takes to actually stand in your place and speak your truth. And I think that one of the things that people often don't understand when they think that they have to assimilate to get ahead is that there's immense power in being yourself, and there's immense power in authenticity. And even as this country has had a very long-standing tradition of the melting pot, we've had an equal and countervailing investment in individuality and authenticity, and in being ourselves.
One last question for the second segment. In addition to having to downplay in the workplace their family responsibilities, how about some of the outward appearances that women are forced to confront? The demand for they must talk properly, walk properly, be competitive, but not aggressive. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is actually a way in which I think that women are differently situated from most other groups, and that the dominant group, men, asks them both to cover and reverse cover at the same time. So that women are asked to play like men and adhere to male norms. This is what we were talking about earlier with childless women being more likely to get ahead in the partnership ranks. But at the same time, because women are seen as nurturing and comforting and loyal and kind, at the point where women conform too much to the male norm, they're policed back in the opposite direction by men who impose a reverse covering demand
They're
on
called
them.
bitches.
Exactly, and so the key case here is a 1989 case called Price Waterhouse versus Hopkins, where Ann Hopkins was told to be as aggressive, as any man in order to make partner at a big 8 accounting firm. She had no problem doing this, but at the point where she became too aggressive, they rejected her for partnership. And the advice that they gave her was, next time you're up for partnership, you should walk more femininely, dress more femininely, wear more makeup, have your hair styled, and go to charm school. So this is a catch-22, right, in the sense that you're policed back in either direction. If you deviate too much towards being like a woman, in which case you're not validated as a worker, or if you're too masculine, in which case you're not valid as a woman.
That charm school business is very ironic because these days a lot of companies are studying their male executives to what in effect is a charm school to learn how not to be such jerks in the workplace.
Right. I actually think we should all go to charm school. So if there were an equal opportunity charm school, I think that
some of
we
us
would
don't
all
have
be.
any charm. It would be useless. But nevertheless, we have to take another break, Kenji. Stay with us. We'll be right back with Kenji Yoshino. Great. Welcome back. Kenji, you talk a lot about courts now dealing with the question of whether a person who is African American or Latino or gay or Jewish or a woman not being punishable for what you term the immutable traits that these represent, but instead they are punished for acting in the way that people with such immutable traits sometimes act, and the inherent contradiction of this. So why don't you elaborate on that, if you would?
Great, yes. So I think it might be helpful just to kind of proceed with examples of each.
Sure.
Because I think when things are concrete, they're sometimes easier to latch onto.
Right.
So, if someone were fired from the workplace for their skin color, right, they would win their employment discrimination lawsuit in a hot second.
Right.
However, if someone was fired from the workplace for wearing cornrows as an African American woman, actual case, or for lapsing into English in an English-only workplace, actual case, they would not get redress. Because the idea is that your hairstyle or the language that you speak is something within your control, and therefore you should have to control it.
Right.
Similarly, if you are a woman who is fired simply for being a woman, for having 2 X chromosomes, then you are going to prevail. But if you are fired either for being too quote-unquote feminine, or even for being a mother, the outcome is much less clear. The jurisdictions are breaking in both directions.
Right.
Of course, in some jurisdictions, you can be fired just for being gay. But even in jurisdictions where you are protected for the status of being gay, you are still much more vulnerable to employment discrimination if you're doing anything that's perceived as flaunting, such as engaging in a private same-sex commitment ceremony.
Right.
And so we see this distinction in between being and doing, where being is protected, but doing the things associated with the identity or not. And the point of my book, and the reason that I argue that this is problematic, is that I don't understand why the claim that somebody can assimilate should shift so quickly into the claim that they must assimilate without any intervening exploration of the legitimacy of the demand that they assimilate in the first place.
Yeah.
So, when American Airlines fires Renee Rogers for wearing cornrows, what it's basically saying to her is, look, why is this so important to you? It's just hair. When you can hear her saying back to them, well, why is it so important to you? If it's just hair, why is my employment being conditioned on it? And I think that we have to actually at least entertain the idea that one of the reasons why American Airlines has a problem with cornrows is because cornrows are associated with African American identity, and that this is just racism updated for a new time period.
Don't you think that this kind of thing where deference is automatically given to the point of view of either the government or the employer, so that the other person has to justify what he or she is doing, don't you think that this represents a kind of shift in American thinking from freedom to control?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I would have to think about that across a variety of contexts and before I gave a categorical answer to that. In the context that we're talking about right now, I actually think that what is needed is a balance of both interests. So I actually have no problem with requiring the plaintiff to establish what in law is called the prima facie case of discrimination, that she belongs to a particular class, that she was qualified for the job, et cetera. But where I feel like the current law is falling down is that it often doesn't require the employer to disgorge a reason, once that prima facie case has been made, for why the discrimination that it's engaged in or the activity that's engaged in is
let me put
permissible.
this one to you. Women who might want to wear cornrows as a salesperson, or a man a Jewish man who might wear a skull cap, they will be faced with the employer's argument that people react badly to this, and that is bad for sales, and therefore forcing somebody not to wear the skull cap or not to wear cornrows is a legitimate condition of employment, right?
Well, it's a little bit complicated because the answer that the law in the books gives is that third-party animus, so anti-Semitism on the part of a consumer, can never be a justification for why an employer would prevent somebody from actually engaging in a practice that was associated with their religion. So I can't fob off, my own prejudice onto a third party and then justify it. If
In
it's
free
wrong
speech
for
terms,
me,
it
it's
used to be
wrong for
called a
them.
heckler's veto.
Exactly.
But in civil rights in 1964, they used to say, well, you shouldn't pass a public accommodation section because white people will not come in and patronize restaurants that serve African Americans. Those arguments are by the board in law.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. But the way in which they get around it in these courts, Larry, it's actually quite sneaky, is that, say, in something like the cornrows case, what the courts do is they say, well, cornrows are so trivial that this can't really have an impact on the individual. And so if it's such a de minimis impact, then we're not going to actually require the employer to come up with a reason. So the employer doesn't even have to come up with a reason, whether it be animus or whether or not be workplace harmony or whether or not be a uniformity requirement. We don't know in the American Airlines case that I just articulated what American would have said to justify its no cornrows policy because the court never required American to come up with that because it said this is just hair, it's
How
trivial.
about the peyote cases?
Well, the peyote cases are interesting because the peyote cases are covered under the First Amendment, all right, because this is a freedom of exercise claim for Native Americans who were smoking peyote for sacramental purposes, even though Oregon had a statute that classified peyote as a drug, as whose use was criminalized. And what the court did in that context, this is Justice Scalia writing in 1990, was to say, so long as a law is enacted with what's called facial neutrality, that it doesn't single out a particular religious group or isn't enacted with discriminatory intent against a particular group, then it's going to be okay for the most part. We're not actually going to scrutinize the law and to make sure that this is whether this is problematic or not. And the reason that this is troubling is that Justice Scalia, in defending the standard, said that the reason that we have to have this kind of solution is because there are just way too many groups in American society. And in a cosmopolitan nation such as ours, he says, we cannot grant exemptions from laws of general applicability because otherwise people will be saying, oh, I belong to the Church of Marijuana, also an actual case, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas in my preferred framework would be to say, well, actually, let's look at the religionist interests and let's look at the state's interests and let's balance the two against each other rather than having a per se rule for or against assimilation.
Well, look, when you look at it, I understand what Scalia said. And I can understand that if people begin to create new religions so that they can smoke marijuana at will or so they can murder people, I mean, this is not quite the same in my estimation as either the Amish, who had kept their, and who won, but that was 40 years ago. They didn't send their children off to public schools, but this had been going on since the 1600s. And peyote for Indians, Native Americans, that had been going on, well, there were no white people on the continent when that started.
Yeah, well, you're not going to hear a disagreement from me. But, I mean, just to give the backstory for those who are less familiar with this line of doctrine, I mean, in the early cases, the court was sort of existing in a state of innocence. So in 1963, in the Sherbert case, the court actually gave an exemption to Seventh-day Adventists. In 1972, the Yoder case, which is the Amish case, the court again exempted the Amish from a Wisconsin requirement that they attend school until a certain age because the Amish believed that high school corrupts all of us, and they were probably right about that one, right?
Probably. The high schools I went to did, yeah.
But at some point between 1972 and 1990, when the peyote case was decided, the court kind of woke up and they realized that, wow, there are a lot of religions out there, so we have to be careful, right? But in the end, I ultimately agree with you, which is to say, look, I would be crazy if I were saying that I'm against all forms of assimilation, right? For us to wear clothes or to speak a language or to obey the law are forms of assimilation. But what I'm arguing for in the book is not against all forms of assimilation, but against forms of assimilation that are not backed by legitimate state reasons. So even the same form of covering might be okay in some contexts, but not in others. So just to take an example from religion, which I think is a really fascinating case, just as a sidebar, going back to what you were saying about the Marranos earlier, ironically, I think that the group that has most closely tracked the gay progression through conversion demands, passing demands, and covering demands have been religious minorities like, the Mormons, or Jews, where the closest historical analog we have to Don't Ask, Don't Tell is Queen Elizabeth saying, I will not open windows into men's souls, right? So she's saying, I'm not going to actually ask you what your religion is, so, and you don't have to tell me, and so we'll just like have a détente here. And that's, I think, the best historical antecedent for Don't Ask, Don't Tell. But I digress. And if we go back to the accommodation cases, so let's imagine the same activity, wearing a headscarf, as a Muslim woman.
Right.
There was a Florida case and a Kansas case, both involving headscarves. One was a woman, one was a girl, right? I believe that both of these cases were correctly decided, but they came out in opposite directions. And what distinguishes these cases for me is the strength of the state's interest, right? So take the Florida case first. The Florida case concerned a woman who refused to remove her headscarf on her driver's license photo. And the state said, you have to remove your headscarf, and she sued, saying this is a violation of her free exercise rights. The Florida court quite rightly said, look, we understand this is a burden on your exercise of religion, but the state's interest here is really compelling insofar as the state has to be able to identify you on your primary form of state identification. And so therefore, unfortunately, your claim has to fall. I believe that case is correctly decided because the state's interest is actually strong. In the Kansas case, there was a girl who was wearing a headscarf who was told to remove the headscarf by a public school. In that case, a public school said, well, we want our kids to look uniform. But the Bush DOJ, to its credit, looked into the case and discovered that the school didn't have a uniform requirement and basically was not actually asking that all the children look the same in the sense of wearing navy blazers or anything. It just didn't want this little girl to wear her headscarf. And that just smelled bad to the Bush DOJ. And so it said to the school, this looks too much like religious animus, so we want you to give an exemption. And the school caved, and the little girl is still wearing her headscarf.
So the same thing can mean different things and can arrive at different results in different circumstances. Let me ask you a question about lawyers. I was extremely struck, thunderstruck in your book to read that in the Supreme Court one day, there were, in the Lawrence case, there was an argument, the question was, well, why would a school possibly not want a gay man to teach kindergarten? And the lawyer didn't have an answer, and Scalia came up with the answer, maybe so that students will not see a role model that will push them into being gay. And the people in the courtroom laughed at him.
Exactly.
I've never heard of laughing at a Supreme Court justice to scorn, not at a joke he made. This was scornful laughter. That leads me to the question, can we or why can't we depend upon lawyers and the law to make the necessary changes that you would like to see?
Right. Well, I guess the first thing I want to say is that one of the most striking things to me about that laughter was how quickly who was laughing and what valence has changed over time. Because if you go back to the Stonewall period, Edmund White talks about how he was actually in the Stonewall bar.
Can I tell you something? You got 1 minute.
Sure. Okay, I'll talk really fast. He said gay is good, and they laughed. So gays weren't even able to take themselves seriously. In '86, when Bowers was decided, Justice White said this claim is at best facetious. So he was laughing at us. Now it was gays laughing at Scalia. And I think that what's really important about this is that we have a court that is outside of the mainstream on gay rights issues, right? So that the majority of the country actually believes that gays should not be subjected to hate crimes, that gays should have equal rights in employment. And so therefore, Justice Scalia was being mocked. I think part of this, Larry, is because it's a very long, at that point, before Roberts, it was a very long-standing court. So the membership of the court hadn't changed in such a long time that we hadn't had such a stable court since the early 19th century. And so the court's personalities, I think, became more vivid, and we came to understand the justices as individuals. But I think that was a very healthy thing, because I think sometimes the polity has to be able to, citizens like you and I need to be able to engage in laughter and in disbelief, when our leaders engage in tactics that we view as so outdated as to not only be implausible, but to be laughable.
I'm reading a book now, which is I'm going to tape the show in about 3 weeks. Back in the Revolution, the hoi polloi, guys like me, used to pull down the houses, literally pull down the houses of the government officials and the lawyers because they were so out of touch with what people generally wanted. I mean, wouldn't you think it's true that the law profession in general, that's an important qualification, in general, is really, you can't really expect change through the law profession. 1954 through 68 was an aberration. Now, I guess we must have another 30 seconds left.
Well, I don't know. I can see that going both ways. I mean, I think this is a really contextual determination in the sense that oftentimes lawyers, precisely because they belong to educated classes, are more forward-looking along some dimensions than others. So we can think about Brown versus Board of Education, or we can think about the current gay rights decisions, the more recent ones like Lawrence versus Texas, where Justice Kennedy writes an amazing opinion in that case. But you're also right that what Justice Scalia, ironically, himself says is that judges are bad at making policy because they're so disconnected from the world at large. I think that laughter in that courtroom was showing that he himself was susceptible to that dynamic.
We have to wrap this up. Fascinating subject, fascinating subject. Thank you very much for coming up from New Haven.
Thanks
and I
so
hope
much
you don't
for
get as
having me,
lost
Larry.
on the way back to New Haven as we got on the way to Brookline, be that as it may. Thank you for being with us. This is to the audience, of course. Thank you for being with us, and be with us again for the next installment of the Massachusetts School of Law's Books of Our Time. Thank you.